This is the Nintendo Switch OLED model, and even though I skipped out on buying a Nintendo Switch for several years, this thing has quickly become one of my favorite handhelds ever, or home consoles ever, I guess. But despite having this OLED Switch, I always kind of liked the look of the Switch Lite as well. But of course the Switch Lite can't really compare to the OLED in terms of this display. So I decided that I wanted to build the ultimate Nintendo Switch Lite. And this is going to be a project in several different parts, which we'll go over in a few moments. But at the core of this project is this, well, really junky Nintendo Switch Lite I bought for super cheap online. This cost me around 40 Great British pounds on eBay, which I think was a pretty amazing price, especially for a fully working if totally wrecked Switch. This Nintendo Switch powers on and the touchscreen works, but there are a few broken buttons like the L button, the analog sticks are of course drifting, and it's just overall in extremely poor shape. But other than all of those physical defects, the Switch itself actually works fine, and that makes this a perfect donor console for this ultimate Switch Lite project. So like I said, this project has several parts. And the first one is going to be general repair and a reshell. And that essentially means that we're going to be taking this Nintendo Switch Lite and giving it a brand new lease of life in a new case. The second part of this mod is going to be the overclocking mod. Now using a certain type of device that you can attach to the motherboard, you can enable your Switch Lite to be overclocked and perform way better, often reaching 60 FPS in even the most demanding games, among some other benefits too. And then the final stage of this mod is going to be the OLED screen mod. And Taki Udon has been showing off this OLED screen mod for the Switch Lite for quite a while now. And what better way to bring the Switch Lite in line with its big brother than to give it an OLED screen of its own. Now the OLED isn't actually available at the time of making this video, but rest assured that it will become the final stage of this mod. Before I continue, I'd like to thank the sponsor of this video, PCBWay. PCBWay is the ultimate partner for all of your DIY projects, providing a range of services from 3D printing, CNC, and PCB manufacture. I do a lot of 3D design in my spare time. When I want professional level results for my projects, I always go to PCBWay.com. Here you can choose from a huge range of services, whether you want just a higher quality or a different material of 3D print, or a fully CNC machined result. You can choose any type of material, any color, you can choose for it to be painted or not painted. Really, the options are endless. And the best part is that you can get an instant quote for your design simply by uploading it and answering a few questions. So please go ahead and check out PCBWay using the link in the description box below. And thanks again to them for sponsoring this video. But for now I think it's time to give this Nintendo Switch Lite a little more dignity with a full shell swap. And I'm going to be swapping this shell out for this beautiful all-white shell from Extreme Rate. I bought this for about 28 Great British pounds, which I think is a pretty good price, although you can get it a bit cheaper on AliExpress. But it's a really nice looking case and I'm really confident in Extreme Rate's quality. As you can see, this Extreme Rate shell looks absolutely beautiful. And it seems really high quality too. You also get everything you need in the box to perform the shell swap, including all the screwdrivers and other tools you might need. Also, you get a QR code that will send you to Extreme Rate's official installation guide, which is on their YouTube channel. And that video guide is absolutely essential to performing this mod. The video itself is over an hour long, which gives you an idea of how complicated this is. Oh, did I mention that? This shell swap is a very, very difficult mod to complete. Now, I personally believe that anybody can do anything if they really put their mind to it and don't rush. But definitely bear in mind that this is not for the faint of heart and you are going to require a complete and utter disassembly of your Switch Lite. This particular video isn't necessarily a tutorial as much as it is just a walkthrough of what I did. But if you're considering doing this yourself, just go ahead and watch their tutorial video so you know fully what to expect. So I began by taking off the plastic back shell of my Switch Lite. There are two different styles of screws to remove on the back, top and bottom of the Switch Lite. And then it's just a case of using a plastic opening tool to pry off the back cover. I didn't feel any need to be particularly careful with this part because I'm just going to toss the original shell away anyway. Once the back shell is off, you'll see a heat shield like this. And there are a couple of screws to remove here as well to remove the heat shield. Now by the way, at this point I want to mention something. If you want to do this mod, you must keep track of the screws that you're removing from the Switch. The Switch Lite I think has somewhere between 16 and 20 different types of screw. And if you happen to put the wrong screw somewhere, you could potentially damage your Switch Lite permanently. And genuinely, my biggest regret of this build is that I didn't keep track of my screws. Now, iFixit, a website I absolutely love, provides step-by-step instructions on how to disassemble the Switch Lite, which along with Extreme Rate's video is what I used for the disassembly. And they will actually tell you what the size of each screw you're removing is. And what I recommend doing is setting up different pots for each type of screw and labeling them as you go. So for example, have a tub marked for 3.5mm screws. That way when you come to reassemble, you can do the guide backwards and find the exact right screw. Trust me, the worst part of this entire process is keeping track of screws, so just make sure you're proactive about doing it. The Extreme Rate mod actually does come with a new set of screws, but I found that mine actually missed quite a few and also they looked a bit different. Anyway, rest assured that the screws are the worst part of this build, so just keep track of them. Anyway, after the heat shield was removed, it's time to unplug the battery. The first thing you have to do is to make sure that this ribbon cable is removed safely. This cable connects the left motherboard and the right daughter board, and you just need to flip up the connector and slip it out. Then just lever the battery connection out. Remember, whenever you're working on electronics, your first priority should be to unplug the battery as soon as possible, and that will prevent any kind of shorts or burnouts or anything like that. So with that done, it's time to remove the heatsink, which just comes off after removing 3 screws and a bit of this foam tape at the top here. I'm going to end up replacing this foam tape anyway, so I just cut through mine. And then I did the job of disconnecting all of the ribbon cables on this board. There's a whole bunch of them, so just refer to the iFixit guide if you want to see what all of them are. But the goal here is to disconnect absolutely everything. Next we unscrew and remove the cartridge slot and the 3.5mm headphone jack. And then the ribbon cables underneath are for the touch interface and the display. Next we'll unscrew and remove the L2 and R2 button assemblies. We definitely want to keep hold of these membranes under here because we'll be reusing them. Next we remove the right speaker and then unscrew all of the remaining screws on the right hand side daughter board. And then that should just lift out. I was really starting to realize at this point how absolutely disgusting this Switch Lite was. I mean, yeah, it was super cheap, but good grief. Now it's time to just finish up this right side here. Well, I guess technically it's the left side, but whatever. I unscrewed and removed the analog stick, and then used some tweezers to remove the gasket as well, because we'll be reusing it. And then I just grabbed all the remaining buttons and membrane, including the D-pad. And now it's time to move on to the main board. And this part isn't too funky, you just need to remove the speaker and then a few screws, and then the entire main board will simply lift out. It's kinda crazy when you see just how tiny the Switch Lite motherboard is. I was impressed by the condition of the motherboard because actually it all looks okay, other than a small amount of corrosion around a few of the contacts which I was easily able to clean with isopropyl alcohol. But I can't really complain for 50 quid. Anyway, I removed the rest of the buttons and the analog stick and the gasket from the right hand side as well, or the left hand side, whatever you want to call it. And with all of that removed, it was finally time to give all of these buttons and membranes a bath in just some warm soapy water. And boy did they need it. Honestly, I almost regretted starting this project at this point because this Switch Lite was absolutely disgusting. I mean, I knew the condition was bad, but I mean, this was gross. I actually really wish I had worn gloves for this, but whatever. I just dunked all of these in some warm soapy water and just walked away. And then it was time to remove the central mounting plate from the Switch Lite. And again, this is simple, you just remove a few screws and it will lift out. Just keep track of those screws again. And with all that done, we're now ready to actually begin to install the Extreme Rate shell. However, there is of course a caveat here, because I really didn't want to have this like fluorescent green Animal Crossing colored bezel on my all-white Switch Lite. So I actually purchased a replacement Digitizer. This Digitizer is matched with the Pokemon Edition Switch Lite and it's kind of a light grey color, which I thought would go really well with my Switch Lite. Now if you want to do this mod, I'm going to tell you to not do this. As you're going to see quite shortly, this ended up being a bit of a disaster. And when I say don't do this, what I mean is don't buy a Digitizer by itself. And that's because if you're going to replace the Digitizer, you then have to remove the LCD screen. And then you risk damaging it or getting dust on it or getting smudges on it, and it's really just not worth the trouble. This Digitizer alone cost me about £10, but a Digitizer and an LCD screen assembly only costs about 20. And so looking back, what I should have done is just bought the assembly together and used that. Of course, I'm going to eventually install the OLED screen, so that's not a problem for me. But if you're doing this and you want to replace that bezel, You will have a much easier time if you spend the extra money and buy the Digitizer screen combo instead of just trying to replace the Digitizer. Well, anyway, let's move on. So here's the front shell of the Extreme Rate case, and I placed it down on a nice microfiber cloth to prevent it from getting damaged. The Digitizer is just going to slot into the front part, and the kit handily comes with some adhesive tape for you to install to stick the Digitizer in. And this is really simple. All you gotta do is try and make sure you place it in correctly, and then pull the upper layer off. You'll be left with a thin layer of sticky tape that you can stick the Digitizer on with. There were a couple of loose parts on mine, so I used my tweezers and screwdriver to just push it all down flat. And then taking the Digitizer, I needed to make sure that the cable was going toward the right analog stick. And then I simply lowered the Digitizer into place and pressed it firmly closed. And if I do say so myself, I think this looks absolutely fantastic. And so the next step was to remove the original LCD from its Digitizer, and you're going to see that this was just a complete and utter nightmare, and I wish I had never even tried. But anyway, I just used a hairdryer to remove the Digitizer from the original shell. All you got to do here is to loosen the glue enough that you can pull the Digitizer and screen out. And because I don't care about the original Switch Lite shell, I was okay with bending and snapping this a bit. And then it was time to do the same thing with the Digitizer and LCD assembly. I again gently heated the adhesive and then inserted my plastic opening tool between the Digitizer and the screen. You have to be really careful at this point because you don't want to damage the LCD and it is incredibly fragile. But all things considered, this actually came apart fairly easily and I was left with the LCD display in the end. There was still quite a bit of glue left on the edges of the LCD, so I just used some rubbing alcohol to gently remove that. So now we basically have to glue the display into place. And I'm using this T700 glue to do so. This stuff is like magic. It kind of has a wettish gel texture, but it glues really solid but in a really flexible way, and it's really good to seal parts together really firmly. It also comes with a very, very thin and narrow tip, which makes precise application fairly easy, although maybe not easy enough, as you'll see in a moment. I tried as hard as I could to carefully apply a thin layer of glue around the edges of the Digitizer on the inside, but unfortunately I did get some on the Digitizer glass itself. I used a Q-tip dipped in alcohol to just simply push the glue away, because the alcohol kind of changes the consistency of the glue temporarily. It makes it a little more solid so you can kind of push it around. And so then I've placed the LCD display into the central frame of the Switch Lite, because it has an absolutely perfect flush fit in there. And then it's simply a case of pushing the Switch Lite Digitizer down onto the LCD display and pressing it firmly together. Once it was together, I re-added the screws for the central part, just to pull the frame and the LCD together a bit more and give it a firmer bond. Now unfortunately at this point I realized I had made an error, because if you look here there is a small blob of glue on the edge of the screen. Now I really was trying to decide, should I do this? Should I take the whole thing apart again and redo this section? I'd have to remove the frame, I'd have to unglue the LCD and the Digitizer again, I would need to use a Q-tip to clean off the excess stuff on the screen, there was more LCD time exposed so there would be dust getting on it, it might smudge or scratch the glass if I tried. Should I do it? Should I do it? Should I do it? I shouldn't do it. I definitely shouldn't do it. I definitely should not take this apart again and try and fix this tiny blob of glue. It's fine for now, I'm going to replace the screen anyway. I should not do this.
Shem, don't do it. No, Shem, don't do it.
I absolutely should not do this. Don't do it, Shem. Just don't do it.
Don't do it.
Do not do it, Shem. Do not do it. Do not do it. So with all that in mind, I decided to go ahead and do it.
No.
First, I removed that frame, and then I simply pried the LCD away from the Digitizer, because the glue wasn't completely hardened yet. At this point, I knew this was going to be messy, if not a total disaster. Alright, so I got the LCD off, but then the web-like glue fell down onto the LCD display. What I should have done here is checked if isopropyl alcohol is appropriate to use on a raw LCD display, but I didn't do that, I just used it, and just tried to clear off as much of the glue as I could. Then I did the same with the Digitizer. I used an alcohol-dipped Q-tip to remove all of the excess glue. By the way, you might be wondering why I would bother doing this if I'm just going to replace the LCD with an OLED screen eventually anyway, and that is a very good question. So anyway, with everything cleaned up, I reapplied the glue to the digitizer as carefully as I could, keeping the line of glue extremely thin and away from the screen itself. Then I, quote unquote, cleaned both the screen and the digitizer and set about reassembling them. And with all that reassembled together, it looked like the screen was going to be okay. At this point, my buttons and membranes had been bathing in that soapy water for over a day, so I decided to get them all out and clean them real good and then start reassembling the device. And this was just a case of reversing the steps that I had done previously. By the way, I did use brand new analog sticks that I got from Amazon. The only real thing I noted while doing this is I had to use the replacement shoulder assemblies from the Extreme Rate kit. And as I put those on, I needed to make sure that the membranes were as central as possible, otherwise the shoulder buttons just didn't really work right. By the way, if you look at the top ribbon cable on the daughter board here, this is one of the worst parts of this entire build. If you screw the daughter board down and then try and get this cable in, you are going to have a bad time. And it was definitely a good idea to connect the daughter board cable first before screwing the board itself down. And so with everything reassembled, I added some thermal paste along with the heatsink, and we were ready to power on and see if this thing would actually work. You know, I get so weary doing these projects that by the time I get to this point, I just want it done and I kind of never want to look at it again, but I digress. I reconnected the battery cable and then the daughter board cable, and then set to powering on the device. And to my absolute and total relief, it powered up just fine. And it seemed like everything was... oh dear. I should not have done that whole LCD display thing. As you can see here, my using alcohol on the LCD display, which looking back was such a stupid thing to do, has damaged the display. And I have this really light washed out mark in the top left corner. In addition, the quote-unquote cleaning of the digitizer and screen I did just left streaks all over the inside. I really should have paid more attention to it. Now at this point, my non-primate brain finally kicked in and told me, Shem, you're going to be replacing this thing anyway, so who cares? And I was just kind of happy that the reshell was done. So I shut down the Switch and then went to reassembling the rest of it. Actually, there was one last step to take on the back shell. First I had to remove these little pieces from the original back cover, and then basically reinstall them into the new one. These are the covers for the SD card slot and the cartridge slot. And you basically have to screw these down just enough so that they move easily but they're also secure. Then I installed the new speaker covers and the new power button and volume keys, which for some reason I did off screen. Whatever. Snapping the back cover on, I then re-added the final screws and my Switch Lite mod was complete. The kit actually came with a screen protector which has like a white bezel, but it looked really awful actually. This is like the worst part of this entire kit, so I just scrapped it because the grey looks better in my opinion. And with all that done, this absolutely horrendous reshell process was finally complete. I added that TPU shell I got that has these like grips on the back to make it more comfortable. But I didn't actually like this, it was a bit too thick. But either way, I placed the Switch in the shell for protection, and set about playing some Smash Bros. And you know what, I think that this looks absolutely fantastic. Yeah, I know that the smudges on the screen are a real shame, but I'll be replacing this with the OLED mod eventually anyway. And the Switch Lite itself in this Extreme Rate case looks absolutely fantastic. And you know what, I joke about this being a horrendous process, but it actually wasn't. The only problem was that I overcomplicated it by wanting to change out the digitizer, rather than just buying a digitizer LCD assembly pre-built. If I had just done that, I wouldn't have struggled at all with this build. As long as you take it slow and follow the instructions on the iFixit webpage and Extreme Rate's tutorial step by step, it's really an easy process as long as you don't mess with the digitizer and screen. And even if you do mess with the digitizer and screen, if you were to just buy a completed assembly, rather than a separate digitizer and screen, it would be 10 times easier. And you wouldn't have ended up with a messed up screen like I did. By the way, one problem I actually have with this mod is the screenshot button, because the Extreme Rate case just doesn't fit. The button is actually sealed in place here and it doesn't move at all. I could probably go in and fix this with just a little bit of sandpaper or a file, but I don't really care to be honest. I'm not somebody that takes a lot of screenshots anyway. I may do this when the OLED mod comes in, but other than that, I'm not going to take this whole thing apart just to fix it. But anyway, that about rounds out part 1 of the ultimate Switch Lite project. Sure, it was a bit of a grueling process overall, but I'm really happy with the results so far. And I also just love how the Switch Lite feels in the hands even without the TPU case here. And I really think it's a device that's worthy of being modded into something really special. This thing kind of feels like a retro handheld to me, and yet it can play the entirety of the Nintendo Switch library. That's Smash Bros, Super Mario Odyssey, pretty much every Assassin's Creed game ever. The library here is really massive, especially for such a tiny and compact handheld. So anyway, the next step here is to complete the overclocking mod for the Switch Lite. This is going to be a little more difficult as it involves some actual micro soldering. And to ensure that you don't miss that, go ahead and subscribe to RetroBreeze and click that notification bell so you don't miss the subsequent updates. I am beyond excited to finish this ultimate Switch Lite project, and I hope that you'll join me along the way.